Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Uh-oh. Oh, I think I have a fever. And the only prescription is more vampires. Tonight, we discuss The Strain, Season 1. This sci-fi medical TV series twist on vampires premiered on FX 5 years ago and ran for 4 seasons. And we're going to talk about all of them. Oh, we will, one season at a time. But the history of this show began long before it first aired in 2014. Our tale begins some 40 years ago, when a kid from Guadalajara was on vacation with his mom in New York City. He saw one of those skyscrapers that randomly has a gothic mansion on top, and he was like, wow, a vampire must live up there. And then he went down into the subway and was like, whoa, this underground must be boiling with monsters. Much like how humans all have inner demons beneath our surfaces. Because he was that kind of kid. Soon after, he developed an idea for a new twist on vampirism involving parasitic worms that he knew he'd have to turn into a story one day. Flash forward 4 decades, and that kid is now premier film director of gothic monster movies himself, Guillermo del Toro. And he wants to finally bring this vampire idea to the screen. Not to be confused with his other vampire idea from his first film, Kronos. No, this one, the one with the freaky nightmare mandibles. He was able to use parts of it in the monster effects design when he was hired to direct the second Blade movie in 2002, but he wanted to take the wormpires all the way. So a couple years later, he went to the Fox network with an outline for a TV series that was half medical police procedural and half monster horror, heavily inspired by Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was the proto-X-Files. But unfortunately for him, Shaun of the Dead had just come out, and Fox was like, meh, your script's not funny. Can you make it funny? And Del Toro was like, no, which is Spanish for no, and good day, sir, and took his outline back home. Since it was the mid-2000s and vampires were just starting to become the hottest revival in publishing, a friend suggested he turn his TV series outline into novels. But Del Toro didn't feel comfortable writing them himself. He'd never written a novel before, and he didn't know all the CSI details necessary for the procedural genre that he had in mind, what he called hazmat language. So he hired crime novelist Chuck Hogan to write 3 novels with him, and the first came out in 2009. The books did well enough that in 2011 they were adapted into a comic book series, fitting for Del Toro, who's always had a passion for comics. And a couple years later, television was finally ready for dark, gritty, disgusting vampires again, and the books got turned back into the series they were always meant to be. Season 1 follows the first book in the trilogy pretty closely, with some new additions and embellishments. Del Toro's idea for vampires in a big city medical CSI procedural style format was directly inspired by Dracula. We have this idea of Dracula now as something gothic and old-fashioned, one of the classics. But back when Bram Stoker wrote it, the book was actually very modern and scientific. The premise of the story, after all, is that this ancient evil grounded in superstition comes to London, the biggest, most modern, most advanced city of all, and the heroes defeat the vampire with science and technology that was considered advanced at the time. Blood transfusions, typewriters, telegraphs, women in the workplace. Well, a combination of science and religion. Of course, they also use crosses and communion wafers and all that, and Guillermo del Toro talks about how those two things are connected. I feel like science and religion are like a Mobius strip, he says. When you dig deep enough into religion, you find science to explain it. And when you dig deep enough and long enough into science, you find things that are unexplained. And he wanted to explore what he calls the arrogance of science. How, as the world advances in technology, people dismiss superstition and religion and all those beliefs that led to natural exploration in the first place. how technology could make civilization too comfortable or complacent, leaving room for something unexplainable like a vampire to sneak in and attack just when people think they're too advanced to believe in that kind of evil danger anymore. The Season 1 pilot starts with a scene straight out of Dracula, with a ship of the dead pulling into harbor, carrying a coffin filled with dirt in its hold that's about to unleash an ancient vampiric plague upon the modern, technologically advanced city. This time, the 21st century equivalent is a jumbo jet landing in New York full of dead bodies. The Center for Disease Control is called in to investigate, but they fail to contain the epidemic, and zombie-like vampires spread across the city, unleashing pandemonium. Like in Dracula, we have a group of heroes banding together to hunt down the main vampire master to try to stop the plague, and the central characters trying to save his wife, who the master is targeted. And also an old Van Helsing type character who's got all the vampire lore knowledge and convinces the scientists that the superstitions are real, so they learn how to truly fight the monsters with the proper combination of technology and religion. But that's pretty much where the similarities to Dracula end, at least as far as the plot goes. Some of the themes and vampire metaphors are still similar, but a lot of them are updated to reflect contemporary social issues. And the vampires themselves are like nothing you've ever seen before. Del Toro calls himself biologically obsessed, to a morbid degree. His childhood hobby was reading medical textbooks, and he was fascinated with understanding the biology that made up all the historical vampire legends from around the world. How would their metabolism work? How would a diet of blood affect their bones, their organs, their hair? For the strain, he combined elements of lore from Eastern European Strigoi and the Filipino aswang with its projectile tongue to develop a strain of vampire that's spread by parasitic worms. The tiny worms burrow into humans through wounds or any other body cavities or openings and start multiplying under the skin until they take over the human's organs and grow into a giant worm beast that lives in the throat and shoots out of the mouth to latch on and suck other people's blood. The human hosts themselves become little more than shambling corpses used for carrying these worms around to their next meal, losing all sense of their personality and humanity, much more like our modern idea of zombies than vampires. But as we've discussed before, our modern pop culture idea of zombies started with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which was directly inspired by the apocalyptic swarm of vampires in Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. So, yeah. Self-proclaimed helicopter parent of his monster babies, Del Toro wanted a lot of control of the Strain TV series. Originally, he wanted to direct as many episodes as possible around his film schedule, but for season 1, he wound up only being able to direct the pilot. However, he did still insist that all creature design decisions went through him, and he did the final color correction on all the episodes so that they maintained a consistent, super saturated comic book look. For instance, he demanded the color red be avoided as much as possible, theming the whole season in cyan and gold, so that the blood would be much more impactful when it appeared. We also see red standing out for things like this oddly anachronistic dress on the little girl vampire in the pilot's final scene, distinguishing her as a symbol of the horror about to be unleashed upon the world. The show combines this stylized comic book aesthetic with highly realistic documentary-style camera usage to create an unsettled reality. Then, when the camera work evolves to be less realistic and more smooth and fantastical for specific scenes that are more horror-driven or atmospheric, the mixture results in a show look that TV had rarely ever offered. And this juxtaposition of film styles sets the tone for how Del Toro's strain of vampires is digested by the audience. Even though he conceived the story that became the novels and then became the series long before Twilight existed, because the show premiered in 2014, in the era of prime vampire fatigue, a lot of people try to pat him on the back for doing vampires right again and stomping on the romantic vampire boyfriend genre. But he is not here for your vampire shaming, and he's usually quick to nip that kind of discourse when it comes up. He cites John Polidori's The Vampire as the beginning of vampires in the English language, and explains how that particular work was a marriage of the romantic and the monstrous. Both sides of that have been there from the very beginning and are equally valid.
He was birthed as a romantic hero and a monster at the same time. So either obsession is correct.
He just happens to personally prefer the monstrous, so that's what he writes. He sees a great literary value in romantic philosophical vampires, but for The Strain, he just wanted it to be a fun summertime series, the gazpacho of horror, he called it. Not something schmaltzy and introspective about feelings, but that doesn't mean it's without theme or messages, not at all. After all, comic books can be incredibly deep, and his show is perhaps even more so than he may realize.
You know, it's not about, it makes you reflect about the loneliness of fuck that shit. It's like, let's go.
Fuck that shit, you say? And yet, Guillermo del Toro, your characters here are all so lonely. The technologically advanced, highly scientific world of modern New York in the series is depicted as a city full of people utterly isolated from each other, disconnected from their own communities. Millions of people, each of them alone in the crowd. Our central character, Ephraim Goodweather, who everyone calls F, is going through a divorce because he's such a workaholic that he never made time for his wife and son. There's actually a lot of parents in this story, and all the mothers except one die or become zombie-pyres, leaving their children motherless and alone by the end of the season. Part of the reason the epidemic is able to spread is because a hacker disrupts all internet and networks in the city, and the people are unable to communicate in the way they'd become reliant upon. Technology was what connected them, but in reality it's actually isolating them as they lost a sense of true connection. A cautionary tale to us all. Oh, hold on, gotta check this. The zombie-like vampires themselves are symbols of loneliness and disconnection. They're too mindless to angst and brood about their loneliness themselves, sure, but the metaphor is clearly there for the audience to reflect upon. Del Toro describes them as hollow corpses inhabited by an unholy will, based on historical vampire lore. Here, that unholy will takes physical form as a scary-ass monster worm, but it's implied that there's something religious or supernatural behind its biology to be revealed in future seasons, perhaps? As the worm slowly takes over the infected person's body, we see how the hosts lose their humanity, their heart, literally, as the human hearts are replaced by vampire hearts. We witness the horror of what it's like to lose control of your own physical being to an unstoppable outside will. And then, in a fresh twist on the usual mindless flesh-hungry zombies, the infected specifically seek out to target their own loved ones as their first victims.
Love is going to guide them all back to their homes, to their loved ones.
This is also inspired by historical vampire lore, which has its roots in superstitions surrounding consumption epidemics. People believed that those who died from consumption would rise from the grave and come back home to consume their own families. Of course, this is actually due to the infection historically spreading in close quarters to their families because of, germs and stuff. Excuse me, it must be vampire season. But making these predators have an intrinsic desire to feed on their loved ones first adds an extra layer to the usual zombie-style horror.
There is another force, a different type of hunger, an unquenchable thirst that cannot be extinguished. Its very existence is what defines us, what makes us human. That force is love.
And love turning into destruction is the ultimate perversion of the heart, of humanity.
It feeds on us, and we feed on it. Love is our grace. Love is our downfall.
The way the show discusses love likens it almost to a religion itself, to a supernatural force at odds with science.
Love, you see, is the one force that cannot be explained, cannot be broken down into a chemical process.
It's comparing love to the medical aspect of these vampires, the strain itself. It can all be explained scientifically, realistically, to a point. But eventually, you run into question marks. Like much actual science in the real world that we haven't yet been able to fully explain. Where did it all begin? I don't know. A wizard did it. Maybe a space wizard. The series gets deeper into all of this as it goes on, but those questions are seated in season 1. The body horror also parallels the helplessness and violation characters feel when trapped by their life circumstances, which turn them toward desperate, sometimes gruesome acts. Jim's wife dying of cancer leads him to betray his friends and help unleash the plague. Nora's mother's dementia tests her emotional limits. Gus's criminal record and need to protect his family lead him to work for the masterminds behind the outbreak. The mastermind's own old age and failing liver leads him to seek the vampire in the first place. Our bodies betray us. Our minds. Our society. Our God? Much like many religiously inspired vampires, the light of day can destroy these ones. And one of the fun marriages of technology and superstition the show delivers is the heroes using medical UV lamps to fight them. But in a city with such a massive subterranean component, it turns out to be an impossible battle. During the day, the vampires hibernate in the subway tunnels, bringing us the disturbing visual of a literal underground full of monsters, truly delivering that metaphor for what's boiling beneath the human condition Del Toro imagined as a child. Because you see, the vampire was deep within you all along. That is, it could be. You see, these poor, mindless, ambulatory worm conveyors aren't the real monsters, they're just the victims. They're pitiful, and you feel sorry for how their victimization turns them into victimizers. No, the real monsters in this story aren't mindless at all. Not all vampires in this world devolve to this level. The Master, for instance, can think and talk and plan. He is an active agent of evil, consciously wanting to spread his vampire worm plague across the world for reasons that aren't explained yet in this season. He's very much an inhuman creature. Though his host body was once human, the vampire consciousness inhabiting it is pure worm thing, but a thinking, feeling, scheming worm thing. Though, as sinister as he is, he never would have been able to enact his vampire world takeover plan without thoroughly human monsters assisting him. Human monsters far too similar to those who walk among us in the real world. Dare I even say, those who rule us? The true villains of the story are these guys, the masterminds I mentioned, Thomas Eichhorst and Eldritch Palmer. Eichhorst is a vampire now, but we see through flashbacks that he started as a very human Nazi officer during World War II, where he worshipped the Master, whose vampire philosophies of supremacy and world domination aligned with his Nazi ideals.
But suppose a new right rose from the ashes of this one, led by a new Führer, who was able to deliver everything Hitler promised and more.
I think that would be a very sad day for humanity.
Quite the opposite, my friend. It's what humanity craves. A strong leader. A visionary.
As the Master's chosen servant, Eichhorst eventually becomes a special kind of vampire who can keep his mind and personality and still move through the human world without suspicion. We see, though, that his appearance of humanity is all literal artifice, makeup, and prosthetics. The monster boiling underneath his surface is as visually hideous as his soul. Eldritch Palmer is a human who wants to be a vampire, though he needs nothing supernatural to make him a monster. Unlike Eichhorst, who was drawn to the vampire for philosophical reasons, Palmer simply hungers for immortality. He's old and sick and dying and offers to help the Master destroy the world in exchange for health and eternal life. He's able to do this because he is wealthy and influential. The politicians and officials he conspires with to make the vampire plans happen are all members of a privileged elite. And this selfish greed and abuse of power is one of the themes that ties in with the old Dracula metaphors of the vampire as the wealthy aristocracy exploiting the less privileged. This is one classic vampire allegory that's still painfully relevant today in a world where the powerful people affecting society on the government level care more about personal profits than the future of humanity. On issues of, I don't know, climate change, education, healthcare, economic disparity, basic human rights. The vampire as a metaphor for abuse of privilege and capitalism and stuff could not be more obvious here, with Eldritch Palmer as a rich white man in a literal high tower draining the lives of the little people below for his personal gain. But moreover, Palmer represents the monster that is the entire structure of a society that allows powerful elites such as him to exist at the exploitation of others in the first place. It's telling that Eichhorst and Palmer are the only two humans we see who actually want to become vampires. The strain makes an effort to be as unromantic as possible with its vampire depiction. Part of the reason executive producer Carlton Cuse wanted to make the show finally happen so many years after Del Toro conceived it was because he was excited about a scary and dangerous alternative to the romantic, lovelorn vampires that had become so ubiquitous. And the strain's vampires are hideous and disgusting, not at all alluring to the audience or any of the characters in the show, except for these two powerful men. This kind of ugliness is seductive to the extremely privileged, while the average Joes who make up the rest of the cast see the vampire for the utterly inhuman horror it truly is and are repulsed by that. Much like how the horror of the infected losing control over their own bodies is symbolic of mental, physical, emotional disease, it's also a metaphor for a country's corrupted power structure that sometimes it seems no amount of voting can correct. It's only a pity that the society has become so arrogant in their comfortably, scientifically advanced lies that they don't realize the monsters boiling under the surface until it's too late. Why can't people just get off their smartphones and talk to each other once in a while? And get off my lawn! And yet, the memes are the only thing keeping me sane in the trash fire of our Lord 2019. And that's all just the beginning. We see yet another angle to the vampires in the mysterious appearance of these guys, who are like vampire ninja commandos or something, and show up out of nowhere, killing the infected. It's revealed at the end of the season they were working for this cabal of comatose vampire ancients in opposition of the Master, but any more information about them and how they're connected to everything is left for later seasons, which we will discuss soon. Oh yeah, the plot gets thicker, and we are going through all 4 seasons of this show together, so to be continued. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and excuse me, make sure you wash your hands and stuff, because you might catch something. That is, unless you want to. Thank you so much to my Patreon patrons for supporting these videos. Thank you especially to the Patreon patron who pledged a request for me to review all 4 seasons of The Strain, which we are going to do not right in a row because I kind of want to space them out for variety's sake, but we'll get to them all soon. If you would like to help me make more videos about vampires and support the spookiest channel on YouTube, consider joining my Patreon. $2 per video gets you exclusive early access to all my videos, and I always put them up on Patreon first before they go public, usually for at least a couple days, sometimes even longer. This one's actually going to be on there private for almost a week. So come on over to Patreon and join me. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Leave me comments on this video. Subscribe to my channel. Like the video because you know you like vampires. Good night.